Clara Boone had learned early that the West didn't pause for anyone's grief, not even for a 24-year-old widow with a soft voice and hands worn raw from work. The world kept turning, the dust kept blowing, and Rimstone Station opened its doors each dawn whether her heart felt ready or not. Life here ran on coffee, cattle, and grit, and if you didn't have any, you borrowed some from the sunrise. 2 years had passed since her husband, Earl Boone, never came back from a cattle drive. One moment he was promising to buy them a patch of land and plant peach trees along the creek. The next, she was bearing a pine box with men she barely knew standing around her. A spooked steer, they'd said. A bad fall. A neck broken before he hit the ground. The West killed quickly and without apology. Clara didn't have family. Only distant cousins who lived 100 dusty miles away and sent no letters. So she hired herself out to Mrs. Albright, the owner of Rimstone Station, a halfway stop between Prescott and the rail line. A place where cowboys drank hard, slept short, and rode out before dawn with dust clouds trailing behind like ghosts. Every morning began the same. Clara swept the porch while the sun rose in a streak of red across the plains. She fed the chickens, warmed the biscuits, scrubbed the long wooden counter, then prepared herself for the stampede of boots that would clatter through the front door. Cowboys didn't mean harm, most of them, but they were loud enough to shake the bones of a woman who had lived too long with silence. Sometimes, during the chill of early dawn, Clara paused to study her reflection in the cracked window. The woman who stared back had shadows beneath her eyes, hair braided tight so the wind wouldn't grab at it, and a mouth too familiar with the taste of swallowed tears. She had once been soft-hearted. Maybe she still was. But softness didn't keep a woman fed out here, so she'd learned to work harder than the ache in her chest. Yet, under all that exhaustion, something else had begun to rise in unspoken fear that this was it. That life had shrunk to wiping tables carrying plates, and sleeping in a narrow bed with blankets that smelled faintly of soap and loneliness. That Earl had taken the best chapters of her story with him to the grave. Clara wasn't bitter. She simply believed her future had already been written, and it was a quiet one. What she didn't know was that destiny rarely stayed where people put it. That morning, things felt different, though she couldn't explain why. The dawn felt warmer. The wind held the scent of distant rain. Even the chickens clucked with unusual energy. Mrs. Albright had asked Clara to fetch extra water from the spring. Since a herd had come through the night before and used up most of the barrels, Clara tied her shawl against the breeze, grabbed the wooden bucket, and set off along the narrow trail that led behind the station. The walk was familiar past the cottonwoods with bark rough as old leather, over the small ridge where lizards warmed themselves on the rocks, down toward the low-lying basin where the spring shimmered like a silver coin, tossed into the earth. She often spoke to her husband on this walk. She didn't expect an answer, just comfort. "Earl," she whispered, stepping over a fallen branch. "I'm doing the best I can." Her widowhood had taught her many lessons: how to stretch flour for 3 days, how to carry grief without letting it drown her, how to hide tears in the crook of her elbow when serving breakfast. But the spring? That was her refuge, a place where she set the world down for a moment. She expected to find it quiet. Instead, her world shifted. As Clara reached the final bend and stepped out beneath the cottonwoods, she froze. Droplets of cold shock raced down her spine. Her fingers loosened, and the bucket thudded softly against her skirt, because a man was in the water. Not just any man. A towering Apache warrior stood waist-deep in the spring, his back broad as a barn door, his dark hair slick and dripping. Sunlight glinted across the curve of his shoulders, and for a heartbeat, Clara forgot how to breathe. She hadn't expected anyone. Certainly not him, and as he turned slowly, sharply, instinctively sensing her presence, destiny took its first breath. Clara Boone? had seen all sorts of men in her 24 years, dusty cowhands with sunburned necks, ranchers with tempers like gunpowder, drifters who smiled too wide and talked too smooth. But she had never seen a man like the one standing in the spring that morning. The Apache warrior was carved from strength itself, tall, broad, with muscles shaped by years of riding, hunting, surviving the brutal honesty of the land. Water glided down the lines of his chest, catching in the quiet ripple of the pool before spilling away. His long black hair clung to his back, heavy with water, and the morning light cracked across his skin like gold-splitting stone. And Clara? Poor Clara nearly forgot how to breathe. She took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her breath hitched in her throat, the bucket slipping from her fingers into the grass with a soft clatter. The sound echoed louder than thunder in her ears. The warrior turned instantly, not with panic, not with aggression, but with the poised alertness of a man who had lived his whole life reading danger from the wind. His dark eyes locked on hers, and everything inside Clara went still. For a moment, the world shrank to the quiet splash of water and the hammering of her own heart. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, loud and confusing. She knew she should run. Cowhands said Apache warriors traveled silently, struck fast, disappeared like mist. But there was no fear clawing at her, no threat in his gaze. Only awareness, curiosity, calm. The man lifted both hands slightly, palms open, unmistakable universal body language. I am not here to harm you. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and steady as canyon stone. The spring is yours. Clara swallowed hard. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. I am the one intruding, she managed to whisper. The warrior tilted his head gently, as if studying not just her words but her fear, or maybe her honesty. His expression didn't shift into anger or shame. Instead, it softened barely, just enough for her to notice. I am Nakai, he said, water streaming from his shoulders as he stepped closer to the bank, still chest deep in the spring. I mean no trouble. I only sought water on my journey. Nakai. The name carried the sound of wind crossing high cliffs. Clara felt heat rush up her neck. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders even though the air was warm. She forced her voice steady. I didn't expect anyone, she confessed. Neither did I. His mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. But spirits guide footsteps where they must go. Spirits. Destiny. Fate. Clara had never paid much attention to such notions. But standing there beneath the cottonwoods with this enormous, composed man watching her like she was a puzzle he meant to understand, something in the air shifted. She took a breath, trying to regain her manners. You continue, she said, motioning awkwardly toward the spring. I'll fetch water later. Nakai shook his head. You came first. I will leave. He began wading toward the shore, water sliding off him in sheets. Clara spun around so fast she nearly tangled her own feet. Heat exploded across her cheeks. I'll look away, she blurted. Behind her. He let out a low, amused hum, not mocking. Just surprised by her fluster. You have nothing to fear. Clara Boone, her head snapped around. How do you know my name? He paused, fastening the leather ties of his shirt with calm precision. I have stayed near Rimstone Station before. Mrs. Albright speaks well of you. Clara blinked. Mrs. Albright talked to everyone but rarely kindly. For Nakai to notice meant he'd listened, more importantly. He remembered. He stepped fully onto the shore, dressed now, the calmness around him returning like a cloak. I thank you for sharing this place, he said quietly. Clara's voice softened despite her racing pulse. It's only water. Everyone deserves that. Naka's gaze deep and steady, respectful, holding something warm she couldn't name. Kindness is rare on the trails, he said. rarer still from those who fear my people." Clara swallowed. Shame pricked her. "I don't fear you." "You do," he said gently, "but only because others have taught you to." He touched 2 fingers to his chest, a gesture of respect, and walked past her. Footsteps silent on the soft earth dot as he disappeared between the trees. Clara found herself clutching the bucket with trembling hands. The spring was quiet, again, but her world was not. Something had shifted in the air. Something that felt suspiciously like destiny whispering her name. Clara returned to Rimstone Station that morning with her bucket sloshing half full, her hands still trembling from the encounter at the spring. She didn't know whether to feel relief, fear, or something altogether different, a strange flutter in her chest that made her stomach tight. The Apache warrior Nakai had vanished among the cottonwoods as silently as he had appeared, leaving only footprints in the soft sand and a sense that her world had somehow shifted. By the time she reached the station, she found cowhands gathered outside the corral, leaning against rail fences and whispering like coyotes. Clara had learned to read the signs: a hushed circle, sideways glances, hands resting on holsters. Something was brewing. "They say an Apache's been wandering these parts," muttered Tom, the lanky ranch hand with a crooked smile. "Saw him near the North Spring this morning. Don't reckon he means any good." "Apaches," another chimed in, spitting into the dust, "will take what they want, mark their ground, and leave trouble behind. Keep an eye on the lady boys. Can't trust them." Clara's pulse quickened. Their words were not new. Ever since she'd arrived at Rimstone, the cowboys' tales of raids, skirmishes, and mysterious warriors had filled the air like dust in the sun. She had never questioned them until now. "Stop," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "You don't know him." And I saw no mark. No trouble. He just sought water. Tom frowned, clearly irritated at the lack of fear in her tone. "Water or no, you don't go trusting strangers out here, especially not Apache warriors. It ain't safe." Clara's chest tightened. She knew their warning came from experience, or maybe just from the prejudice that ran deep in the territory. The West had taught men to fear the unknown, to survive by dividing us from them. And yet, Nakasi's calm eyes, the gentle way he had lifted his hands, the soft hum of his voice, they contradicted every warning she had ever heard. She tried to explain to herself that the men spoke from habit, not truth. But a part of her heart, conditioned by solitude and hardship, trembled. Could she trust what she felt? Could she trust a stranger? That evening, Nakai appeared at Rimstone Station, not with menace, but with patience. He approached quietly, hands visible, wearing a simple leather tunic and carrying a small bundle of hides. The cowhand stiffened, instinctively reaching for holsters, but Clara stepped forward. "You may enter," she said, surprising even herself, "so long as you mean peace." Nakai inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I seek only trade," he said softly, spreading out the hides. "I have furs from the mountains. In exchange, I hope for food and clean water." A hush fell over the men. They whispered among themselves, their skepticism barely contained. But Clara noticed something in Nakai's posture: calm, respectful, deliberate. He didn't dominate, threaten, or flaunt his strength. He offered, and nothing more. "Some hearts see truth," he said quietly, looking directly at Clara. "Others only see what fear tells them." The words hung in the air. She repeated them in her mind over the next few days, testing their weight. Fear had shaped life in Rimstone for years. Fear of strangers, fear of conflict, fear of the unknown. And yet, here was a man who demonstrated courage through honesty, integrity through restraint, and strength without violence. Curiosity replaced caution. Clara began to notice small things. The way Nakai moved with a lightness that belied his size. the careful attention he gave to the water he drank and the herbs he carried, the respect with which he treated the animals around him. He was a teacher disguised as a traveler, offering lessons on survival, observation, and harmony with the land. Through him, Clara began to see the West differently, not just as a place of hardship and danger, but as a land of possibility, where the stories men told could be questioned, and where courage could take forms other than guns and intimidation. By the end of that week, Nakai and Clara had developed a quiet companionship. He taught her how to identify edible roots, how to track deer without startling them, and how to read the wind for signs of rain. In return, Clara shared her knowledge of cooking, cleaning, and tending to wounds, a practical, valuable knowledge that Nakai respected. Through these small, simple exchanges, Clara realized that truth often lay hidden beneath rumor, that courage could take the form of honesty and restraint, and that friendship, real, patient, respectful friendship, was possible even in a land shaped by fear. And as the sun dipped behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, Clara felt something she hadn't in years, the stirrings of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't finished yet. Destiny, she thought, might be closer than she ever dared to imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Rimstone Station began to feel different to Clara Boone. The usual hum of life, the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of boots across the wooden floors still filled the air. But something subtle had shifted in her own world. Nakai, the towering Apache warrior she had first seen at the spring, had become a steady presence in her days. He did not command attention, nor did he demand recognition, but his quiet strength and patience seemed to settle her restless heart. It began with small exchanges. He would arrive at the station in the early morning, bringing hides and herbs, his boots kicking up soft clouds of dust. Clara would greet him at the door, her hands busy with breakfast. Yet she found herself noticing the way his eyes scanned the horizon, alert yet calm, as if he had learned to read every shadow, every wind ripple, every whisper of nature. "Clara," Nakai said one morning, holding a bundle of sage and dried roots, "these may help with aches. They can also ease the mind when it worries too much." Clara blinked, surprised by the thoughtfulness. She had spent most of her life fending for herself, believing that strength came from endurance alone. Yet here was a man teaching her a different kind of strength, one rooted in knowledge, observation, and care. "I didn't know herbs could do all that," she admitted, taking the bundle. Her fingers brushed his as she accepted it, and she felt a warmth spread through her she could not name. Nakai smiled faintly. "The land teaches what books cannot. One only needs to pay attention." Soon the lessons expanded. He showed her how to track the signs of animals in the dirt, to anticipate their movements, and to read the wind for changes in weather. He taught her how to identify plants that could heal wounds and those that could be eaten safely. Every afternoon, they wandered together along the ridges, the creek, or through sparse forests, sharing the silence in a way that spoke volumes. For Clara, these moments were transformative. She began to see the West not merely as a land of hardship, but as a living teacher, full of lessons that required patience, observation, and respect. Through Nakai, she realized that survival depended not only on strength of arm, but on wisdom, empathy, and the ability to trust. And gradually, the fear she had once felt, the whispers of cowhands, the old stories of violence, the sense of perpetual danger began to recede. It wasn't gone, for the West never allowed total safety, but it became tempered by understanding. One evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the mesas and painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Nakai and Clara sat beside the creek, cleaning hides and preparing food for the next day. The quiet was comfortable, almost sacred. "You carry sadness like a heavy saddle, Clara," Nakai said softly. looking up from his work. "You can set it down, even for a moment." Clara's fingers stilled. His words were gentle, but there was a weight to them, the kind of weight that only comes from someone who sees beyond appearances. She wanted to argue, to insist that grief was hers alone, that strength meant carrying it silently. Yet when she looked into his calm, steady eyes, she could not. "I suppose I could try," she whispered. He nodded, as if that small admission was a victory in itself. "The land is generous to those who learn its ways," he said, "and to those who allow themselves to see, to listen, and to trust." Clara realized then that she had begun to trust him not blindly, but with careful observation, respect, and a growing sense of safety. And in that trust, a strange, exhilarating warmth began to bloom. It was not love, at least not yet, but a promise of something that could grow. Nurtured slowly by patience and understanding. As twilight deepened, the first stars appearing like silver dust across the darkening sky, Clara felt a sense of hope she had not known in years. Here was a man who respected her, who taught her, who walked beside her not as a savior but as an equal. And in the vast, unpredictable West, such companions were rare treasures indeed. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara Boone dared to imagine a life beyond survival. A life with laughter, with learning, with shared burdens and mutual respect. And though she did not yet know what the future held, she felt a certainty that, with Nakai by her side, she could face it with courage. The West had brought hardship, yes, but it had also brought her a teacher, a friend, and perhaps the first stirrings of a heart that could love again. Life at Rimstone Station had begun to settle into a rhythm that Clara Boone cherished. Mornings filled with chores and quiet sunrises, afternoons spent at the spring learning Nakai's lessons of tracking in herbs, evenings with laughter softening the lines of worry on her face. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt the pulse of possibility in her chest, but the West was never content to let calm linger. One scorching afternoon, the distant rumble of hooves warned Clara before she could see the riders. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, and she instinctively felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her pulse quickened. Remembering too many stories of bandits, drifters, and men who saw opportunity and fear. As the riders approached, the glint of guns and the harsh lines of their faces confirmed her suspicions. They were a rough-looking group, men whose eyes gleamed with greed and whose teeth were set like iron. One of them, taller than the rest and wearing a wide-brimmed hat, called out in a voice roughened by too many drinks and too much sun, "Where's Clara Boone?" "We're here for what your husband owed." Clara's heart sank. Earl's death had left debts she had struggled to pay, and now, apparently, someone sought to claim more than money. They sought intimidation. To prove that a young widow alone could not stand against the world, she clenched her fists, trying to hold back the panic that threatened to rise. Behind her, Nakai emerged from the shadows, silent as a mountain cat. Clara had been so absorbed in the danger that she had almost forgotten he was there. "You don't belong here," Nakai said calmly, stepping forward. His voice carried an authority that silenced even the wind for a moment. The leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "And who's going to stop us? You? A lone warrior?" Nakasi's met the man's, unflinching. The silence between them grew heavy, charged like a drawn bow. For a moment, Clara thought the men might attack. But Nakai didn't move with anger or aggression. He simply stood, tall, unwavering, radiating a quiet power that demanded respect without a single weapon raised. "This woman owes you nothing," Nakai said again, voice low but firm. "Leave, before your greed costs you more than you are prepared to pay." The men hesitated, their confidence shaken by the calm that clung to Nakai like a second skin. They had expected fear, submission, perhaps a fight, but not this. A giant of a man, unarmed, yet commanding the scene as if the land itself had lent him authority. "Get out." Nakai barked this time, his tone sharper, and Clara could see the coiled strength in his stance. Every muscle promised swift justice if crossed. For a moment, it seemed the desert itself held its breath. Then, slowly, the drifters retreated, their horses kicking up dust as they fled toward the horizon. The threat passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the echo of hooves and the lingering scent of fear. Clara's knees nearly buckled, and Nakai's strong hands were there to steady her. She pressed her face against his chest. Overwhelmed by relief and something deeper, something like gratitude, awe, and the first sparks of trust and affection. "You saved my life," she whispered, voice trembling. "No," Nakai answered, his lips brushing the top of her head in a gesture so gentle it belied his immense strength. "I stood with a woman who deserves a future. But you choose what that future is." Clara lifted her head, meeting his eyes. For the first time, she realized that Nakai did not seek to control her or dictate her path. He stood with her, yes, but he never tried to command her heart or her choices. That distinction, subtle but profound, made her chest ache with an unfamiliar longing. The station, now silent again, seemed almost sacred. Clara felt the weight of the danger lift, replaced by an exhilarating sense of freedom. The West had brought hardship, yes, but it had also brought Nakai, a man whose strength was measured not in violence but in courage, integrity, and respect. She took a deep breath, letting the dust settle in her lungs. The danger had passed, but the lesson remained. Trust, she realized, was not given blindly. It was earned through presence, patience, and the quiet demonstration of loyalty. Nakai had earned it without threat, without force. And in that moment, as the sun dipped behind the distant mesas and painted the sky in gold and crimson, Clara Boone understood that destiny had not just placed Nakai in her path. It had tested her. It had shown her the measure of a man worthy of her trust and perhaps her heart. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a fragile smile. The West had brought hardship, but it had also brought a second chance. Standing right there beside her, the danger at Rimstone Station had passed. But the quiet that followed felt different this time, full, alive, and brimming with possibility. Clara Boone stood on the porch, the wind teasing strands of hair across her face, and watched Nakai move among the horses. His movements were calm and deliberate, every step carrying strength tempered by patience. She thought of the first time she had seen him at the spring, the way his presence had unsettled and intrigued her at once. Now she understood that meeting had not been a random encounter. It had been a turning point, a gentle nudge from destiny telling her that life could offer more than survival, it could offer connection, respect, and love. Nakai approached, wiping his hands on a piece of leather. The quiet confidence in his eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Clara," he said softly, "I have traveled many lands, crossed many rivers, and yet none have felt like home until now." Clara's heart skipped. She had learned much from Nakai about the land, about herbs, about reading the subtle signs of wind and animal tracks, but she had also learned something more profound about herself. She had learned that trust could be rebuilt, that courage came in many forms, and that love could arrive even in the harshest landscapes. "I feel the same," she whispered. The words tasted strange, vulnerable, yet liberating. She realized she was speaking not from fear, not from obligation, but from the stirrings of her own heart. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the station. Nakai took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle, a promise of partnership rather than possession. "Then let us walk forward together," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the words feel sacred. Clara nodded, squeezing his hand. She understood then that their bond was built on more than attraction. It was built on shared respect, patience, and mutual understanding. Nakai had taught her that strength was not just about wielding power, but about knowing when to stand firm and when to nurture. In the following weeks, their partnership deepened. Nakai helped Clara expand her knowledge of the land, showing her which plants could heal, how to track cattle across miles, and how to anticipate weather changes by watching the sky. In return, Clara taught him aspects of the ranch life he had not yet known: cooking for a household, mending tools, and the subtle social rhythms of the station. Each day they learned from each other, blending their worlds without erasing the uniqueness of either. The community began to notice the change. In Clara, she walked taller, laughed more freely, and carried herself with a confidence born not from solitude, but from shared strength. The cowhands, once wary and skeptical, now nodded with quiet respect when Nakai passed through, understanding that trust and courage could cross cultural divides. One crisp morning, Nakai led Clara back to the spring where they had first met. The water shimmered in the dawnlight, reflecting the golden hue of the sun. He knelt on one knee, placing a simple woven band of leather and beads in her hands. "Clara Boone," he said, "I offer you not just protection, but partnership, respect, and my heart. Will you walk with me through all the seasons ahead?" Tears pricked Clara's eyes, not from fear, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of joy. She smiled through the tears and held his hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Nakai, I choose to walk with you." The station echoed with the distant calls of cattle and the soft wind through the cottonwoods. But in that moment, all the noise of the West fell away. Clara and Nakai stood together, two souls who had faced fear, hardship, and uncertainty and emerged stronger. United not just by circumstance, but by choice. They married that spring. A simple ceremony blending Apache and frontier traditions. The station and surrounding community celebrated not just a union, but the harmony that could exist when respect and understanding bridged differences. Clara wore a dress stitched by her own hands, and Nakai's attire reflected his people's heritage. Honoring both worlds, they cherished as seasons passed. Clara often returned to the spring where she first met Nakai. She remembered the fear, the uncertainty, and the quiet courage that had brought them together. The West had tested her, challenged her, and shaped her, but it had also given her a second chance. A chance at love, partnership, and a future she could embrace with both hands. Clara Boone, once a widow defined by loss, now stood as a woman defined by resilience, knowledge, and love. And Nakai, the towering Apache warrior, became more than a protector. He became her equal, her teacher, and the man who had shown her that even in the harshest landscapes, life could bloom unexpectedly, beautifully, and endlessly. The West had been harsh, yes, but in the end, it had also been kind, and Clara, hand in hand with Nakai, finally understood that destiny, patience, and courage could create a life worth living.